Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. Today's topic is investing in Israeli digital health companies, and our guests are Levi Shapiro and Goel Jasper. Now, Levi Shapiro is the founder of mHealth Israel, a nonprofit community which currently consists of over 638 companies that supports Israel Connected Health and medtech community. And Goel Jasper is the Digital Health Innovation Group leader at Finn Partners. Today, listeners will learn about how connected health companies navigate clinical trials, group purchasing organizations, and the reimbursement landscapes. We discuss how these companies protect their secret sauce, the importance of predicates, and crucial tips on receiving capital from strategic investors. Stay tuned as Levi Shapiro and Goel Jasper discuss some of Israel's most promising digital health companies. Among the companies discussed are BioTax, Switch, and Theranica. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Solution Nation. I'm David Wanatik. I'd like to introduce two gentlemen that will speak to us on the issue of digital technology pertaining to healthcare. Levi Shapiro comes to us from mHealth Israel, and Goel Jasper comes to us from Finn Partners. So Levi, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about mHealth Israel. I see your announcements all over LinkedIn and know you're very active and work with lots of very dynamic Israeli healthcare technologies. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work.
Sure. So Israel has a large pool of technical talent, and that technical talent is more and more focusing on addressing U.S. healthcare challenges. And I run a nonprofit community, mHealth Israel, which is elevating the overall level of Israel's health tech innovator community to continue solving those challenges. The number of companies continues to grow from about 110 connected health companies 8 years ago. Now that number is about 638. The amount of capital has grown.
Approximately.
Yes. A couple of sources for that data. In the macro, the fundraising has been terrific. It's about 6 or 7x larger than it was 8 years ago. From my side, I've been not only a community builder, but also an investor. And I'm a managing partner in a fund called Pragmata VC, looking across biotech, device, digital health, and healthcare adjacent like supply chain. And really, this moment when valuations are lower is a great opportunity. I think it's a really good time for innovation and focusing on the basics, which is revenue, go-to-market, clear reimbursement strategies. And I'm sure Goel can talk much more about success in that area.
Okay, great. Thank you. Goel, would you like to tell us a little bit about Finn Partners?
Sure. I'd rather just listen to Levy, but if you ask, I guess I have to answer because the truth is that Levy has really played an unbelievably significant role in terms of the development of health innovation in Israel. I can't even put into words how in such a short time. How long have you been here, Levy?
Now 10 years since I came over from the United States.
Yeah, in 10 years, he's just done so much. A little bit about Finn Partners and what we're trying to do. we're an international communications agency. Traditionally, we would have been called a PR firm, but given how technology has impacted communications, it would be a little silly to refer to ourselves as doing PR. All areas of marketing communications, and in Israel specifically, and I think the reason why Levy thought it would be such a good idea for me to be part of this, in Israel, we focus almost exclusively on health innovation for two reasons. Number one, there's a tremendous amount that Israel is doing in terms of health innovation, and what I'll talk about a little later is that the Israeli innovation mindset doesn't necessarily match up to how health innovations can actually reach the market in markets like the US and some European markets. And number two, working in health gives all the members of the team here a feeling like we're really helping to make a difference in the world, and that's really important to us as well. So there's a lot of work to be done here. There's tremendous innovation going on in health. I would say it's science fiction, but it's real. So it's like science and nonfiction.
Great, thank you, Goel. Levy, I wanted to ask you the first question. You mentioned there's approximately 638 connected healthcare technologies in Israel, companies. That seems like a lot for a pretty narrow niche from a small country, even though there's a lot of talent, a lot of intelligence and capital in Israel. It still seems like a lot. Do you think there's been too much funding? Do you think, of course, when you look at startups, many of them fail. That's natural. But do you think there's too much dispersion of investment in healthcare technologies in Israel, and maybe it should be a little more concentrated to make sure there's some winners?
Sure. It's been much more capital certainly deployed, particularly in the last 3-4 years. But there is a dispersion of capital. So there's roughly 400 biotech companies in Israel. There's roughly around 600 device companies, and somewhere around 638 by my count of digital health companies with a lower cost of entry, a shorter time to market, and therefore an easier path for achieving milestones. Now, we have an organization here that tracks performance of companies, and only about 6%, according to IATI, only about 6% of Israeli life science companies are at revenue run rate of 15 million or more. So there's a huge disconnect. There's this huge pool of companies, often that are subsidized at the R&D stage, with quite a bit of generous programs run by the government. Within the Israeli government is a department called the Israel Innovation Authority, which has significant budgets for R&D stage projects. And as a result, Israel is disproportionately over-indexing in terms of product stage companies that enjoyed the government grant for productizing their R&D stage product. Usually those programs require 50% private funding, and that's also been very favorable for de-risking angel investments in Israel. Is that too much? Yes, 94% of those companies are not really crushing revenue right now. There's many reasons why. What we've seen, I think, is an arbitrage opportunity, okay? Because the quality of teams addressing health challenges is just as good as the talent addressing cyber or fintech or any other sector. But the number of unicorns is actually completely out of whack. There's very few, perhaps two, one could argue K-Health, Viz.ai are unicorns, but the same talent is cranking out unicorns in fintech and in insurtech and cyber. So there's something wrong. And that's where I think that folks like Goel, investors like myself, I think that's where we potentially can help companies to be winners. really focusing on things like reimbursement, focusing on connecting that product market fit, which is a huge challenge, accelerating that process to market, in some cases generating revenue from Europe before going to the United States. So yes, there's a lot of capital, but only about a quarter of all the venture funding in Israel is going into life science. In the United States, that number is about 40%. And so it could be argued that proportionally, Israel is underfunded in life sciences. In the macro, that number has accelerated drastically over the last decade. But I think there's some runway for investments in great technology that require a turnaround, a restart, a down round. This is a moment for plucking great technologies and pivoting for product market fit.
Okay, great. Levy, how would one categorize these approximately 638 companies? When I think of connected technologies, I think of telemedicine, electronics, records management. What kind of categories do you use to assess these companies?
Essentially, the synergy of IT and healthcare delivery. So, for example, AI for pharma is a very hot domain. Companies like Curis, companies like Immune AI, companies like Nuclei, terrific technologies solving a real tangible problem. The problem is developing a blockbuster drug is somewhere between $1.7 and $3 billion and takes something like 15 to 17 years. So if these technologies can map the process, accelerate the process, and improve the process, that's IT and healthcare integrated. So it's not just some cool digital app that tracks how many times you snored last night, but really solving big problems using digital.
Okay. And just to stay with you for another minute, are there a few very intriguing technologies that you would like to tell us about that are coming out of Israel?
Well, we had this pandemic, and we learned that health happens everywhere, not always in the health system. We also learned that our health systems were not equipped to meet the moment. And so the companies that interest me most as a result of the pandemic are undertaking truly transformational change rather than a simple cheaper, better, faster. Transformational change that includes the Internet of Biological Things. The Internet of Biological Things means not just IT, but IT meets biology and provides better treatment than one or the other. So for example, moving care to the home, there's a home dialysis product called Liberty, Liberdi, I think is terrific. Moving OSA, sleep apnea, to the home. A company here called Itamar Medical managed to get the first reimbursement payment coverage and coding in December 2019, and therefore timed the market perfectly, which allowed them to not only increase their market cap, but ultimately get acquired by a company called Zoll. And so moving health out of the clinic and into the home, I think is a great opportunity. And addressing those, let's say, core fundamental problems. Right now, we don't have enough nursing staff. So I've seen a company that's like an Uber, not necessarily for nursing staff, but for clinical research. The drug discovery process typically outsources the clinical trials, and they do that with clinical research organizations. And Uber meets Indeed for clinical research analysts to access that talent pool and maintain that talent pool throughout their career. Transformation is what the world needs and is willing to pay a premium for that.
Are there any technologies that concern you? For example, some people are concerned that apps or other technologies that track people, maybe because they have COVID or have had COVID, or maybe they track people based on their vaccination status. On one hand, that might be a very good tool to use to manage a pandemic. But on the other hand, some people are very afraid of where this can lead if people are tracked all the time. So are there any technologies like that that are of concern to you?
My concern are those that overpromise and underdeliver. We've seen some very interesting published research recently in The Lancet, which tracked the performance of wellness apps, popular wellness apps, health, mental health wellness. The truth is they're not, according to this study, and obviously it's only one data point, but they're not really doing what they promised to do. That bothers me, that frightens me, and eventually it could turn people off to digital tools. I should mention though that downloads for those mental health, the major mental health wellness apps are down something like 60+% since last year. So yeah, I think that overpromising and underdelivering in medical is probably not a great status.
Okay, great. Let's go to Goel for a few minutes. So Goel, when one of these interesting companies that we're talking about starts in Israel but wants to expand its market, let's say they want to come to the United States, what are some common issues that these companies haven't yet considered and that are a disappointment or surprise to them?
Sure. I would. By the way, I would start by saying that most Israeli health innovators, whether in the world of biotech, the world of devices, or the world of digital health, they start their business focused on markets outside of Israel. So it's pretty rare that a company will try to conquer Israel first and then move to other countries. I just think the other countries have larger markets, larger potential for the growth of the business. So they begin with that as their focus. Having said that, many people in the world of Israel health innovation come from the tech world. And as you know, in the tech world, the paradigm is, sort of if you build it, they will come. Create the product or create the app or create the software and start selling it. And in the world of health, obviously, it's different. And I think that many of these entrepreneurs sort of learn as they're going that acceptance of health innovation is a much longer process, as Levy mentioned before. And eventually they get with the program, but there can be some frustration along the way. So what we really try to do, and Levy hinted at this as well, what we really try to do is when they're very early in the company's history, we'll ask them questions like, what is your reimbursement strategy? Do you have a reimbursement strategy? Why do you believe the market is ready for this? What's the feedback been from the community, the scientific community until now? And just as importantly, what do the people in, for example, the IT departments of health systems have to say about what you're trying to do? Because as I think the three of us all know, IT departments wield tremendous power in terms of their ability to say no. They don't necessarily wield power when it comes to health innovation in terms of selecting it, but in terms of questioning whether it's compatible and interoperable with what they have already, they wield almost absolute power. So these are the kinds of questions that companies need to ask at the beginning. These are the kinds of questions that I would hope investors are asking these companies. And to your point before, there are many, many Israeli companies that are receiving funding. I think, as I said, there's a lot of incredible innovation going on, and Israel's startup culture is not necessarily a culture that is focused on, as Levy mentioned, becoming unicorns or building and building and building until you have a multi-billion-dollar company. Very often, these entrepreneurs are trying to create a technology that ultimately is market ready and then can be bought by another company that's more well established and has stronger relationships within the system to actually get it to market. And so, very often a company will exit at, $25 million, $50 million, even $100 million. And that's just fine for the company founders. And that's one of the reasons why the money is spread so widely here, because very often you have situations where it is a niche problem that a company is solving, and everybody's comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll just make a comment, and then you can comment on my comment. In commercializing a digital health company in a place like the United States, one really has to understand the reimbursement scheme, the regulatory situation, dealing with insurers and so forth. Is it important that an Israeli company have professionals on staff that can help navigate that? Or can those challenges be bridged by just hiring consultants or putting the right people on the board or board of advisors?
I think if we can think again about the fact that many of these companies are not securing $50 million rounds, $100 million rounds of funding. Sometimes it's $6 million, $7 million. They want to make sure that they're protecting their capital. I hope they do. And in that context, there are consultants based in the States who can be very helpful in that respect. And we're a big fan of certain ones. And I think it would be a good move for some of these companies to go that route. Of course, as a consultant myself, maybe I'm biased, but I do think it's valuable to go to people who are experts in the market that you're trying to reach, and receive their counsel, and also a faster pathway to reimbursement and codes, can really result from that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. I suppose one concern with that could be that if they develop the product first and then go to a consultant, maybe they don't always develop the technology with the same technology that an insurance company or the government would use. So that maybe there's some congruency there. And along with that, are the technical standards transparent? So would the Medicare, Medicaid, big insurance companies, do they make known which programming languages they use? And so Israeli entrepreneurs would know we should code in this language rather than some novel language that might be better, but it's not going to be congruent with the big payers. How does that work?
Yeah, that's interesting. And much of what you're talking about requires the Israeli startup to think about the U.S. market as they're getting the product off the ground, as they're developing it. And as I said, they're all building their businesses with the U.S. in mind anyway. So I would sure hope, I don't have that information, maybe Levy does, but I would hope that they would not develop a square peg to fit in the round hole of the U.S. healthcare system. Levy, you have any insight on that?
Yeah, one thing that I think we need to work on as a community over here, there's this huge pool, something like 400 multinational R&D centers. A lot of IT companies, more and more from other sectors like fintech, really from the United States health system, the only significant R&D center on the ground at the moment is Anthem. Anthem has an R&D center, roughly around 50 plus people, mostly engineers, and they're leaning into the local talent pool. Your question about standards, let's take Intel. Intel has something like 14,000 staff in Israel. It's very easy for a local company to integrate and, let's say, coordinate technical standards with Intel. Microsoft, thousands of staff in Israel doing R&D. Again, easy for local companies to coordinate technical standards, do product planning, et cetera. Not so easy because the US health system is a very local business, right? Jefferson Health System, I'm from Philadelphia. Jefferson is something like 19 health systems, but they're all in the Philadelphia region, and that's their business. It's they don't have Israeli R&D centers, for example. So that's an opportunity, I would say, for Goel and myself and our community to try to bring more multinationals to set up local R&D operations and thereby accelerating the process of integration. Companies here, if it's a digital health product, need to integrate with the major US electronic health record vendors. That's Cerner and Epic, for example. They can't do that locally. They need to be on the ground in the US and engage with those two companies, some with more success, some with less success. I think the defining characteristic for what makes a winner in terms of digital health is the ability to quantify the return on investment for the customer. If they can quantify the ROI, I think they'll have some very happy customers. Specifically, US health systems, many of them were struggling before COVID. Average margins were something like 2.2%. COVID was an unusual moment. Now, post-COVID, because of the nursing shortage and labor issues, they're all losing money again. And so startups that can walk in the door and quantify the ROI to the purchasing manager, to whomever, will have a much easier sale than those who cannot. And I think that's really the 6 out of the 100% who are able to basically crush the revenue piece. A couple of examples here in Israel, mHealth, NYM, they basically automated the medical coding process in order for health systems to get paid by the insurers. There's a specific ICD code which needs to be manually input into the system. Something like 260,000 Americans have the job of manually inputting medical codes. mHealth is automating the whole process, creating dashboards, creating alerts, so that simply needs to be managed. And all of that loss that comes from fat fingers hitting wrong keys is identified and saved. Companies like that have a very easy path. The challenge for the startups is to learn how to tailor their story in a way that is ROI focused. That's what I think the buyer wants to see.
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump on that train also. I think that when you look at Israel innovation over the decades, it's normally about efficiency and something that has been done a certain way and doing it in a smarter way, in a more cost-effective way. Well, the US health system, in many cases, they're not interested in saving money. They're interested in increasing revenues. And so those companies that can demonstrate how they're going to help a health system actually make more money, those are the ones to keep an eye on. And oftentimes the ones that are in the business of saving money, they're sort of scratching their heads because it's such an obvious benefit in their minds. But that's not the priority for the hospitals, as unusual as that might sound.
Okay, great. This is primarily for Levy, but Goel can answer as well. To what extent do your companies or these Israeli companies protect their proprietary knowledge through patents or trade secrets, or just software code? How do they protect their innovations?
We as a community are improving. There's a lot more sophistication, and it's been an ongoing process. Many of those companies that move from R&D stage to product stage have done that through basically grants, and therefore companies are not investing as much at the earliest stage, not only into IP, but also, for example, reimbursement strategy, FDA. Many companies with limited budgets, some of it which is required by the grant to focus exclusively on technical development, means that some hard choices have to be made. And sometimes the cost is, let's say, convenience over a holistic approach, which includes intellectual property. Let's get these patents filed. Let's get it out the door without thinking that in 8 to 10 years, they may have a really big headache, which will cost them more money. Same with FDA and reimbursement. So the expertise resides in Israel for intellectual property and patent filing. It's fairly efficient, but there's much less, let's say, organic litigation focus in Israel among IP, right? So many of the US firms, for them, filing patents is just standard work. The real money is in litigating. And we're not quite there in terms of awareness. So the downside is not as clear as it should be. Now on the FDA side, the FDA is simply looking for two things. Is it safe and effective? And so all of that, all those clinical trials, that entire process is simply to demonstrate it is safe and effective. But there's still no revenue model. There's no reimbursement until CMS does their thing, and they don't care about safe and effective. It's not even on their agenda. All they care about is reasonable and necessary. And the startups then start over again from zero. They've climbed this mountain to get FDA approval, and they can't monetize because they didn't have enough resources in some cases to simultaneously pursue the reimbursement reasonable and necessary path. And that expertise, to your question about consultants and advisors, that expertise is not necessarily residing in Israel. People who spend a whole career tracking CMS or FDA. Many of these are people who at one point worked in those organizations. And in many cases, that can only come through local advisors. Same thing for Europe. Germany has its own reimbursement path, which is very, very different from other countries. And so that is just expertise from the outside.
And I think a lot of the Israeli companies who are trying to get to market, the question they're asking is, do we need FDA? Can we get away with not having the FDA certify or approve our product? Again, remember, many of them come from the world of tech where that's just not a factor, and so often they're trying. I don't want to say circumvent, but trying to figure out whether they require it. And I think the big winners, in addition to Levy's point about the ROI piece, the big winners are the companies that are taking a mature health innovation approach to their business, and they're doing the clinical trials. They're doing those trials in real world settings in hospitals. And are seeking FDA certification for what they're doing, and understanding that the long-term gain far outweighs the short-term expense. Of course, that requires them to demonstrate that they have a sustainable business so that they get more funding to fund that research, to fund that FDA process and CMS coding process. And many companies aren't willing to do that. But there are a lot of them that have the maturity to say, no, we're going to do this with a high standard?
Yeah, so Goel is being very modest. Goel won Marketer of the Year last year. I forgot the publication. He's also helped an Israeli company to win Product of Show at CES, which is very competitive. They also had one of their products recently that was named one of the cool 50 products of the year by Time Magazine. And so there's some, that's very challenging. Not only just getting through the standard FDA and reimbursement, but making your target fall in love with your product, communicating to stakeholders like physicians. That's where I think there might be some interesting. Give us some inside baseball stories, Goel.
Sure. I'll send you that payment for complimenting me so much, Levy. Thank you. I'll give you one example. There's a company. It's actually the company that was named one of Time Magazine's best inventions. A company called Theranica with a product called Nerivio, which is an armband neuromodulation-based migraine treatment device. Theranica, because their device is such an efficiently created device, they were able to sell it for a price point much lower than current payers are reimbursing for other migraine treatments. And so they were really excited about this until the payers came along and said, your payment model doesn't fit with how we reimburse for migraine treatment. And so let's say, just for argument's sake, normal migraine treatment, I'm talking about drug-based treatments, might be reimbursed around $500 a month. So Theranica was coming in with a device that was only going to be $100 a month. And so the payers said, we can't work with this. So they actually had, it's sort of like scratching, like this. They actually had to price it at $500. Again, I'm just using numbers for argument's sake here. They had to price it at $500 and then give a discount so that people wouldn't have to actually outlay that $500. And so that, that's a scenario where you look at it and you say, what a benefit to the user and to the system that their product costs so much less. But again, so much of working within the U.S. health system is fitting in, and it didn't fit in. And so they had the sort of agility to adjust how they approach things. And just yesterday, they announced, for full disclosure, it's a client of ours, obviously. They announced that they're the first migraine treatment device to be part of the Costco prescription program. So needless to say, they've learned from their experiences, and really the key for a lot of these Israeli companies is to have the humility, which is not an Israeli trait generally, to have the humility to understand that they don't have all the answers and that they should be ready to learn and pivot along the way.
Okay, that's a great case study, and Theranica could book higher revenues, and it may help their valuation that they're booking the $500 of revenue versus $100. So that's good. Goel, as far as the point about companies trying to avoid approval by the FDA or make that process as fast as possible, is there anything you want to say about the role of predicates? If a device company can point to a predicate, and if they can say our technology is largely similar to that, and that one's already been approved, does that help?
I understand the question. I don't know if the question of like, does that help? I'm not sure if that's really what we should be talking about. I think what we should be asking is, are they trying to connect to a predicate for the sake of saving money? Or are they trying to connect to a predicate because it's authentically along the same lines? And I think it's not one way or the other. I think there are definitely cases where that does make sense, and there's no need to go through those processes. But at the same time, I sort of put FDA or regulatory in the same category as science. And so if you're not doing that, you really should be spending the money on clinical trials in real world contexts, in clinical settings, so that you can demonstrate that this thing doesn't just work, on your laptop, but it works in a hospital setting. And I have to mention that there's a hospital in Israel called Sheba Medical Center, which is Israel's biggest hospital, that has invested a tremendous amount of money to help health innovators use Sheba's facilities and clinicians and environment to conduct ththose trials. Unfortunately, the world doesn't necessarily have the respect for an Israeli hospital that they would have for, a Mayo Clinic or a MD Anderson, and others at this stage. But Sheba's working on that, and there are other hospitals here also. Again, considering the fact that Israel really is a country that's all about innovation, a lot of the hospitals, but particularly Sheba, which has a whole division focused on innovation, has a serious commitment to helping these innovations get to market.
Okay. So I have a question dealing with group purchasing organizations. So in the United States, many medical devices or medical supplies that are sold to hospitals first have to go through a group purchasing organization. Is that the case with electronic technologies, or can they avoid the group purchasing organization and go directly to the hospital? And then secondly, you brought up the issue of trials. So if an Israeli medical device company or Israeli electronic healthcare company does a trial at a hospital and that trial is successful, if they normally would have to go through a group purchasing organization, can they avoid that by saying, look, we just worked with you, last few months, you're very impressed. Why do we need to go through the GPO?
Levy, I think I'll hand it to you for this one. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. So am I still muted?
No, you're good.
You're good.
Okay, good. Purchasing is a huge issue. These are organizations of scale that are trying to find three types of scale: scale for growth, scale for relevance, scale for survival, uniting suppliers and providers and payers. And that can be difficult. And therefore, to Goel's point, it's not always the cheapest solution that's the most attractive, because there is a hierarchy of needs in order for, again, using Jefferson as an example, which is 19 hospitals, that scale for growth and relevance and survival. And so some of that purchasing can be centralized, like staplers, et cetera. For new technologies, typically the process is a little different, and it's not oriented towards scale. So the benefit of that is there's a greater fragmentation for trying innovative new products. The downside is if you are deploying with a single department at a health system, that's not scale. That's a single department in one health system, which doesn't automatically translate even to other departments in the same health system. So group purchasing is real. Group purchasing for the kind of solutions that Israeli companies are generating is not quite the same. And really the challenge for companies seeking scale along with their partners is to have design partners in health systems who are ready to build for scale together. For several years, I worked on retainer with the Henry Ford Health System of Detroit, Michigan, and that's exactly what they were trying to do with Israeli startups, was create solutions in which Henry Ford was a proxy for other multi-billion-dollar US health systems, and then deploy that, prove that, quantify that, and introduce that to their peers in other major health systems. So I wouldn't fear the group purchasing. On the contrary, developing tools to enable mass deployment of innovative new products is really the challenge.
Yeah, and just to support that, I think the major issue is on the other end of the spectrum, where these adorable but important startups, they have shown their product or solution to a well-known physician, and the physician's really excited about it, and they think that because that physician of note is excited, like their path is clear. They don't understand that physicians basically rent real estate in American hospital systems, and they don't have the decision-making power, with some exceptions, of course. And so really the bigger challenge is to help the Israeli entrepreneurs understand that there are so many different audiences they have to pay attention to at the same time, and there's no sugar daddy who's going to bring them to the finish line. Everyone has to feel good about what they're trying to do, either in a way that they can say, yes, we like this, or at least in a way where they won't say, no, we don't like this.
Is there some effort to try to incorporate some notion of bedside manner application in the technology? Some industries, it's not all about efficiency. In the banking industry, you wouldn't want to see a bank that increases its its loan originations 30% every year. In medicine, you have to be careful too. One of the big chains in the United States that did eye surgery got in trouble because they were trying to be very, very efficient and only giving the doctors 5 minutes to do a surgery on each eye. And most of them were successful, but a couple
scary.
not. If we wanted to be efficient, maybe we would adopt Pareto's principle and serve the 20% of the healthiest people and let the other 80% fall away. So, efficiency is really important, but also, patients want some notion of bedside manner. So are there any efforts that some of these Israeli companies are making to present their product as both efficient, time efficient, cost efficient, with some element of bedside manner incorporated?
Levy, can I go first here?
Yeah, please.
That's a great question, and it's the kind of thing that in a certain way would be sort of counterintuitive for Israeli companies to think about bedside manner. I don't know if you've ever spent some time in an Israeli bank, but customer service is not even theory there. But there are health innovators that aren't just focused on bedside manner, but their technology is bedside manner. So, for example, there's a company called Sweetch, SWEETCH, and they're all about when it comes to chronic illnesses or chronic conditions, there are certain actions that the clinicians are asking the patients to take, whether it's more exercise or eating properly or sleeping better, and those kinds of things. Sweetch's whole business is about trying to understand the patient better so that the instructions that the technology will give the patient will work within the context of the patient's life. So, for example, instead of it's 2 p.m., take your pills, it's, hey, I see 35 minutes open on your schedule right now. Why don't you take a walk to Starbucks, get a coffee, and come back, and then you will have gotten a nice cup of coffee and done some exercise at the same time. And so that's all about the patient experience. And I'm sure there are other examples that Levy can give as well, but there are companies that are focused on that, absolutely.
About 10 years ago, the famous Silicon Valley venture capitalist Vinod Khosla wrote a blog, which was picked up by many publications, called "The AI Will See You Now." The AI will see you now. And that didn't happen. Exactly, David, because of what you mentioned, which is the human element. And companies that went barreling in that direction, I think, really missed the point. I'm teaching MBA students at Hebrew University, and I make them repeat with me, healthcare is a service. Healthcare is a service. We want to get better. Whatever technology is enabling that is not the priority. It's a service. So whether it's bedside manner as part of the service, it's how Israel, the single payer health system, is able to deliver very high quality outcomes at relatively low cost. So the United States, as you may be aware, is about 18% of GDP. That's the equivalent of a nickel of every global GDP buck is spent on US healthcare. And the outcomes are poor. According to Bloomberg Efficiency Index, Healthcare Efficiency Index, the US was 36 out of 42 developed economies. Israel was third for healthcare efficiency. We're at about 7.5% of GDP. So understanding the service of healthcare is valuable. One of the things I see in Israel that I never saw in the United States is the prioritization of primary care. In the United States, I have a whole stack full of the phone numbers of my various specialists, my orthopedic surgeon, my ear, nose, and throat, but nobody really knows me holistically. In Israel, there's a process whereby about 3/4 of all the physicians are general practitioners. And so your first stop is to visit your GP, who may know that you may be presenting symptoms that are not necessarily exactly typical for going to see a specialist, and most of all, for a hospitalization. The United States, the third leading cause of death is hospital-acquired infections. The place you don't want to send your mother is a hospital, I promise you. And as a result, this focus on primary care, I think, is one of the reasons, even relative to the UK, for example, one of the reasons why we have relatively good outcomes from a single payer system. Also very different from, let's say, the UK, which has a single payer system, is the encouragement of an entire private system. So 25% of Israeli citizens use private insurance. They don't need to. They get perfectly good universal health coverage just from their taxes. But the presence of the private sector creates enough competition that they are having to compete on quality as well. So to your point about bedside manner, the winning companies are not winning on price. They're winning on business model, and business model includes the delivery of a great service. So a great example locally is K-Health. K-Health is one of the Wix founders. Wix is one of the top 3 market cap companies in Israel. And this is absorbing all of the historical 3 decades worth of historical electronic health records data from the number 2 HMO in Israel, and using that for a general practitioner on your handset. And you can send a text and get a response based on all of that historical data. That's a service. I don't have to go and give up half a day in order to wait in line just for 5 minutes of face-to-face with my surly and grumpy doctor. I can do this just with a text message, and if I need to send more text messages, same thing. I'm on the advisory board of a company doing that for mental health. It's called Kai, K-A-I .ai. Same thing. It's all basically real-time AI-based intervention addressing the service of your mental or physical health. So long way to answer that question, but health is a service.
Okay. Levy, just a quick question that dovetails with your recent statement. To the extent that a doctor is using telemedicine, does that impact his malpractice exposure? Does he need additional coverage, or is greater, lesser exposure to malpractice claims if services is provided via telemedicine?
Nobody's happier when there's changes to the regulations than the lawyers. And so before COVID, I used to ask lawyers, what's the telehealth landscape in the US? And they would say something like, it's black, white, and gray, and the majority of states are in the gray area. Stay away from the black, definitely focus on the white, and the gray, we'll take care of you. Now there's, let's say 40 out of the 50 states are very clearly defined as to the risk for healthcare delivery, as well as the reimbursement. So we've had telehealth in Israel for a number of years, and the physicians here actually are quite keen because it's less of their most valuable resource, which is their time. And so they can bill the equivalent of an in-office visit simply by sending a text message. So they're very keen. And in terms of the risk side, that's clearly defined. In the United States, as I said, it's become more clearly defined, but there's still about 20% of the states where it's still a bit murky. But there's too much upside for physicians in the US to avoid telehealth. By the way, once COVID came along, we were quite surprised as to who the power users of telehealth would be. The expectation was this is the worried well in the suburbs with the tip of the pyramid, the people with fancy COBRA plans from their employers. And in fact, although the adoption was slower, perhaps because there was less access to broadband or smartphones, it is the economically marginal group that is most keen about telehealth because they have the most to lose by sacrificing their time in order to visit a physician. And so that's been a real surprise that the people who are often, let's call it the Walmart demographic, many thought that they would never embrace. They're not known as first movers, early adopters, but they're very keen based on some of the data I've seen in terms of the benefits, which is very promising, extremely promising.
This may be a little bit outdated, but before the pandemic, one thing that investors sometimes made a mistake about is when one of the US states would pass a law ushering in telemedicine, people got very, very excited. Okay, this law is passed. There was a big ceremony with the governor, and this is going to be great for telemedicine companies, but it took a long time to write the regulations. So that could take a couple years to get the regulations in place to really be able to promote telemedicine. All that discussion may be outdated now because COVID may have accelerated. Anything you would say about that issue? If Poland decides to implement telemedicine, should we get very excited and assume that implementation will be much faster now? Or should we wait a couple years before investing in those companies?
Yeah, to be clear, the United States is a laggard in terms of mobile services. And you mentioned Poland. Poland and Spain were among the most proactive in terms of wide-scale telehealth deployment. I know, who would have thought, but Poland and Spain, very early, very widespread. Europe allocates about 13 to 14% of GDP for health delivery. They have a very equitable approach. They tend to prioritize their seniors. And so the United States, until COVID, was way behind. But things are now evolving. There's just too much benefit. And so we've seen the numbers fall in terms of usage, but certainly 3x what it was before COVID. What's really changed, though, is the funding. If you had anything related to telehealth in your business model in March 2020, life was very favorable. Amwell, American Well, which was founded by Israelis, they had no intention of raising money. First, they raised 100 million, and they then listed and IPO'd because the market was just so favorable. But the allocation for telehealth companies, that wave has subsided as we've kind of moved into the next phase.
Yeah, and I think if I can suggest something related to that, the U.S. paradigm, as Levy said, is so far from accepting of telehealth and telemedicine that the assumption was after the pandemic, we'll just go back to the way things were. And ultimately, it does come down to revenue, like I said earlier. So if clinicians, if providers can figure out a way to institute telehealth and telemedicine and still make the money they want to make, it will continue to grow. And so, long term, I don't think we have any doubt that that's the way things are going. But there is a pullback because there's such an inclination to want to go back to the way things were instead of realizing that the world is changing. That's sort of to a degree, it's like an American phenomenon.
Okay. And then the last question I have is dealing with strategic investments. So if one of your portfolio companies, one of your clients had an option that had two alternatives, if they could accept money from a venture capitalist or a strategic investor, what are the pros and cons of taking the money from a strategic investor?
Sure. Some of it is balance. In other words, there's a company called BioTax, which is a spin out from a research lab, the Biome Data Lab at Technion, Israel's premier technical university. What they've done is they caught the interest of Illumina, a very prominent corporate, and capped the amount that Illumina could contribute in terms of the total raise. They capped it at 50%. So there's amazing benefits. BioTax has participated in an acceleration program run by Illumina, but at the same time, I think it's a good idea to have balance. If it's one or the other, that's another conversation. And I think it's nice to have balance. If it's one or the other, I would skew towards a strategic who brings in kind. So I'm on the advisory board of a company called Wellbeat. They're the world's largest private systems integrator, has participated in their most recent funding round, and it's a lot of go-to-market support. What Israeli companies are lacking is not technology. What they're lacking is a real muscle-based go-to-market strategic plan. So this UST, Global System Integrator, is putting in capital. More importantly, they're going to dedicate their human capital to growing a real business. That is the kind of corporate money that makes sense.
Goel, would you like to speak about that as well? Any thoughts you have on accepting strategic investment?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about it from a go-to-market and marketing perspective, because that really is how I come at this. I think each of them has their benefits, and I think that both of them have the same drawback, which is control. The more investment you get from outsiders, the more control they want to rightly have in the future of your business. But what's so beneficial about strategics is that they already have a reputation in the marketplace. And so you can point to the relationship with them and them putting their money where their mouths are when you talk about the future of your business and say, if it's good enough for Boston Scientific, it should be good enough for you, that kind of thing. But the same thing goes with VCs. VCs, they have their own track records and they have their own reputations, and a lot of good come from those kinds of relationships as well. But I certainly agree with Levy when he says, if you have to choose one, and I don't think you have to, but if you have to choose one, go with the strategic, because at the end of the day, this is all about making a difference in the world. and bringing solutions to market so that people can live longer lives, healthier lives, more meaningful lives, and strategics can help to clear that pathway a little faster.
Okay, great. So we'll see if you have any closing comments. Levy, anything you would like to say in closing?
Sure. Health is clearly prominent in everyone's mind after the last couple of years. And the silo approach is one of the reasons why we have such problems. For example, healthcare supply chain was never considered in the macro sort of health story. And here we are with major healthcare supply chain problems. So we're on the cusp of bringing value to a $4 trillion inefficient sector. We have to approach this with interdisciplinary teams and skills and solutions. So not so interested in just kind of fixing something, one little thing, not so interested in better, cheaper, faster. Let's repair this big broken system and get more bang for our buck. That's the goal.
Great, thank you, Levy. Goel, would you like to say anything in closing?
Yeah, first I want to just thank you for offering this platform so that people can become more knowledgeable about what's going on in Israel. I know I speak for Levy when I say we appreciate that. And any nuggets that people can attain based on this conversation is wonderful, but I know that what you're doing is much larger than just this one conversation, so thank you. The second thing I want to do is hop on to the fragmented system that Levy just talked about and say that Israeli entrepreneurs are so used to the Israeli system, which really is one of the most efficient in the world. And one of the largest mistakes they can make, which we haven't talked about yet, is to assume that other systems around the world operate as efficiently. And I think the big winners are the ones who do the research in advance and understand what fragmentation means in the context of the product that they're trying to bring to market so that they can address the need in a way that works for those systems around the world.
And if I may, I'd like to plug, we have an mHealth Israel LinkedIn community, 17,000 plus members. It's a great place to see what companies have been funded, where money is being deployed, what are the major trends in terms of life science related published research, et cetera. And so if you're just kind of interested in the domain, it's a great place to get started.
Great. Well, this was an excellent podcast. It's very informative. Everybody that listens is going to learn immensely from our hour together. So I'd really like to thank Levi Shapiro and Goel Jasper for contributing their time and their many years of experience. Very generous of you to share so much knowledge and insight with us. So thank you all to the listeners, and we can conclude the program at this point.